December 25th, 1991. The Oval Office was quiet in a way it rarely was. No staffers rushing through with urgent memos, no phones ringing with crisis updates, no advisors clustering around the resolute desk with competing recommendations. It was Christmas night, and most of Washington had gone home to be with family. But President George Herbert Walker Bush sat alone in the most powerful office in the world, a yellow legal pad in front of him, trying to find the right words for a moment that would define his presidency and reshape the world. At 67, Bush looked tired. The past 3 years had aged him. The Gulf War, the economic recession, the constant criticism that he lacked Reagan's vision, that he was a caretaker president managing decline rather than a leader inspiring greatness. His approval ratings, which had soared to 89% after the Gulf War, had plummeted as the economy soured. David Duke was challenging him in Republican primaries. The Democrats smelled blood in the water for 1992. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, history was moving, and Bush had a front-row seat. On his desk sat a secure telephone, a red light blinking to indicate an open encrypted line to the Kremlin. Mikhail Gorbachev had called an hour earlier, his voice strained but composed, to inform Bush that he would resign as president of the Soviet Union at 7 p.m. Moscow time. Noon in Washington. The Soviet Union would cease to exist. The Cold War would officially be over. Bush had taken the call in the residence, Barbara at his side, their Christmas dinner interrupted by history. He had listened as Gorbachev spoke about the end of an era, about his hopes for the future, about his belief that what he had done, allowing the Soviet Union to collapse rather than holding it together through violence, was the right choice, the moral choice, even if history might judge him harshly for it. "Mr. President," Gorbachev had said in his accented English, "I want you to know that I have always believed we could end the Cold War peacefully, that we could transform the confrontation between our nations into cooperation. I hope that what is coming, the new Russia, the new republics, I hope America will help them succeed. Because if they fail, if chaos comes, the world will not be safer." Bush had assured him that America would help, that the transition would be supported, that Gorbachev's place in history was secure. They had said goodbye with mutual respect, two men who had worked together to end a confrontation that had brought the world to the brink of annihilation. Now, 2 hours later, Bush sat in the Oval Office preparing to address the nation. His speechwriters had prepared a draft, but it felt wrong. Too triumphalist, too celebratory, too much like spiking the football in the end zone. Brent Scowcroft, his national security advisor, had warned him about that. "Mr. President," Scowcroft had said, "we need to be careful. Yes, this is a victory for us. But rubbing it in Gorbachev's face, humiliating Russia, that could create problems down the road. We want them to be a partner, not a resentful adversary looking for revenge." Bush understood that instinctively. He was not a triumphalist by nature. He had been raised in a tradition of New England reserve, of noblesse oblige, of winning gracefully and losing with dignity. His father, Prescott Bush, had taught him that a gentleman does not gloat. And George H.W. Bush, for all his political flaws, was fundamentally a gentleman. But he also understood the political necessity of the moment. Americans wanted to hear that they had won. After Vietnam, after the Iran hostage crisis, after years of being told that America was in decline, they wanted vindication. They wanted to be told that their sacrifices during the Cold War had meant something, that the trillions spent on defense had been worth it, that the proxy wars and the nuclear standoffs and the decades of anxiety had led to this moment. Victory. Bush picked up his pen and began to write on the legal pad, crossing out phrases from the speechwriter's draft, adding his own thoughts in his distinctive handwriting. To understand what Bush was thinking that night, one must understand his unique perspective on the Cold War. Unlike Ronald Reagan, who had come to the presidency with a clear ideological vision of the Soviet Union as an evil empire that must be confronted and defeated, Bush was a pragmatist. He had served as CIA director in the 1970s, had been Reagan's vice president for 8 years, had met with Soviet leaders and studied Soviet society. He understood the complexity of the situation in ways that simplified narratives missed. Bush had watched Gorbachev with fascination and some skepticism when the Soviet leader first came to power in 1985. Was this genuine reform or just another Soviet trick? Was glasnost real or just better propaganda? Could the Soviet system actually change, or was it so fundamentally flawed that reform would lead to collapse? By 1989, when Bush became president, the answers were becoming clear. The Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe was crumbling. Poland had held free elections. Hungary was opening its borders. The Berlin Wall was about to fall, and Gorbachev was letting it happen, refusing to send tanks, refusing to use force, allowing the satellite states to choose their own paths. Bush had managed that transition carefully, deliberately avoiding triumphalism that might provoke a hardline backlash in Moscow. When the Berlin Wall fell in November 1989, his aides had urged him to fly to Berlin, to stand on the wall, to claim victory. Bush had refused. "I'm not going to dance on the wall," he had said. It would humiliate Gorbachev, might embolden Soviet hardliners, could destabilize the very reforms they were trying to support. That caution had been vindicated in August 1991, when hardliners attempted a coup against Gorbachev. For 3 days, the world held its breath as tanks surrounded the Russian White House, and Boris Yeltsin stood on a tank to rally opposition. The coup failed, but it demonstrated how fragile the reform process was, how easily it could have been reversed. Now, 4 months later, the Soviet Union itself was disappearing. Not through war or revolution, but through a bureaucratic process, the republics declaring independence, Gorbachev resigning, the red flag coming down from the Kremlin. It was the most peaceful end to an empire in human history, and Bush understood that Gorbachev deserved credit for that. But Bush also understood that this was, fundamentally, an American victory. The policy of containment, begun by Truman and sustained through 10 presidencies, had worked. The Soviet system had not been able to compete economically, had not been able to match Western living standards, had not been able to maintain legitimacy once its citizens were allowed to speak freely. The arms race had bankrupted them. The ideological competition had exposed their failures. America had won not through military conquest, but through systemic superiority. The question was how to say that without being a jerk about it. Bush's personal secretary, Patty Presok, knocked softly and entered. "Mr. President, we're ready whenever you are. The networks are standing by." Bush nodded. "Give me 5 more minutes." He looked at what he had written. The speech was shorter than the draft his writers had prepared, more personal, less rhetorical. It acknowledged the magnitude of the moment without excessive celebration. It praised Gorbachev without diminishing American achievement. It looked forward to the future rather than dwelling on the past. But there was one section he was still wrestling with: how to characterize what had happened. Was it victory? Triumph? The end of a long struggle? Each word carried implications, sent messages to different audiences, to Americans who wanted validation, to Russians who were facing uncertainty, to allies who had stood with America for 45 years, to the rest of the world watching to see what kind of superpower America would be in this new era. The door opened again, and Brent Scowcroft entered, his slight frame somehow conveying both urgency and calm. Scowcroft was Bush's closest advisor, a retired Air Force general who had served as National Security Advisor under Gerald Ford and had returned to the role under Bush. He was brilliant, discreet, and shared Bush's pragmatic, non-ideological approach to foreign policy. "Brent," Bush said, looking up, "tell me honestly, are we making a mistake by not celebrating more? Am I being too cautious?" Scowcroft sat down in one of the chairs facing the resolute desk. Mr. President, you're being strategic. Yes, some people will criticize you for not dancing in the end zone. But think about what we need from Russia going forward. We need them to dismantle their nuclear weapons safely. We need them to honor existing arms control treaties. We need them to not sell nuclear technology to rogue states. We need them to transition to democracy and markets without descending into chaos or nationalism. He leaned forward. If we humiliate them now, if we rub their noses in defeat, we make all of that harder. We create resentment that could fester for decades. Better to be gracious in victory, to offer partnership, to help them succeed. That's not weakness. That's wisdom. Bush nodded slowly. It confirmed what his instincts had been telling him. You know what Barbara said when I told her about Gorbachev's call? She said, "That poor man. He tried to reform something that couldn't be reformed, and now he's being blamed for its collapse. History won't be kind to him, but he deserves better." She's right, Scowcroft said, and what you say tonight will influence how history judges this moment. You can frame it as American triumphalism. We won, they lost, capitalism beats communism. Or you can frame it as the peaceful end to a dangerous confrontation, with credit to leaders on both sides who chose peace over war. Both narratives are true, but they lead to very different futures. Bush picked up his pen again. The peaceful end to a dangerous confrontation, he repeated. I like that. It acknowledges our victory without gloating. It honors the moment without excessive celebration. He added a few more lines to his notes, then stood. Okay, let's do this. At 5:01 p.m. Eastern Time, President George H.W. Bush sat behind the resolute desk and looked into the camera. The Oval Office had been set up for the address, lights positioned to eliminate shadows, the presidential flag and the American flag flanking him, the windows behind showing the darkening December sky. The red light on the camera came on. Bush took a breath and began to speak, his voice measured and deliberate. Good evening. I want to speak to you tonight about a remarkable event, one that has profound consequences for our country and for the world. At 12 noon Eastern Standard Time, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as President of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union itself has now ceased to exist. The red flag with its hammer and sickle has been lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. In its place, the Russian tricolor now flies. An era that defined much of the 20th century, the era of the Cold War, has ended. He paused, letting the magnitude of the statement settle. Around the country, Americans were watching, in living rooms decorated with Christmas trees, in bars where the televisions had been switched from sports to news, in military bases where servicemen and women understood the implications better than most. For more than 40 years, the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a struggle that shaped every aspect of our foreign policy and much of our domestic life. We built nuclear arsenals capable of destroying civilization. We fought proxy wars on every continent. We competed for influence, for prestige, for the allegiance of nations around the world. The threat of nuclear war hung over humanity like a sword of Damocles, and we all lived with the knowledge that one miscalculation could end everything. Tonight, that threat has dramatically receded. The Cold War is over. The Soviet Union has collapsed not through military defeat, but because its own people rejected the communist system that had ruled them for 7 decades. They chose freedom over tyranny. They chose markets over central planning. They chose truth over propaganda, and in making those choices, they have transformed the world. Bush's voice was steady, but those who knew him well could hear the emotion beneath the words. This was the culmination of his entire career in public service. CIA director during the Cold War's darkest days, vice president during Reagan's confrontation with the Soviets, president during the final collapse. He had seen it from every angle, and now he was narrating its end. This is a victory for democracy and freedom. It is a victory for the American people, who stood firm through decades of challenge and sacrifice. It is a victory for our allies, who joined us in defending freedom. And it is a victory for the Soviet people themselves, who have finally claimed the rights and freedoms that are the birthright of all humanity. But I want to be clear about something. This is not a time for gloating or for rubbing salt in wounds. The Russian people and the people of the other former Soviet republics face enormous challenges in the months and years ahead. They must build democratic institutions from scratch. They must transform command economies into market economies. They must deal with ethnic tensions and nationalist movements. They must ensure that 30,000 nuclear weapons are secured and eventually dismantled. America will help them meet these challenges. We will provide humanitarian assistance. We will support economic reform. We will work with the new governments to ensure nuclear security. We will encourage democracy and human rights, but we will do so as partners, not as conquerors. We will do so with respect for their sovereignty and their dignity. This was the key passage, the one Bush had labored over. He was acknowledging American victory while offering partnership. He was claiming the moral high ground while extending a hand to the defeated. It was classic Bush, pragmatic, decent, forward-looking. I want to take a moment to pay tribute to Mikhail Gorbachev. History will debate his role and his legacy for years to come. But this much is clear. He had the courage to introduce reforms that ultimately led to the system's collapse. He had the wisdom to allow Eastern Europe to choose its own path. He had the humanity to refuse to use force to hold the Soviet Union together. He chose peace over violence, and for that, he deserves the world's respect. I spoke with President Gorbachev earlier today. I thanked him for his partnership in ending the Cold War. I assured him that America would work with Russia and the other new republics to build a better future, and I wished him well in whatever comes next for him personally. Bush paused again, his mind briefly returning to that phone call, to Gorbachev's voice, strained but dignified, accepting the end of his political career and his country with a grace that Bush found moving. Tonight, as we mark this historic moment, we should remember the millions who sacrificed for freedom during the Cold War. The American servicemen and women who stood watch from Korea to Berlin. The dissidents who challenged totalitarianism at great personal risk. The leaders who built the alliances and institutions that contained Soviet expansion. The taxpayers who funded the defense build-up that the Soviet Union could not match. All of them contributed to this moment. We should also remember that the end of the Cold War does not mean the end of challenges. There are still nuclear weapons to be secured. There are still regional conflicts to be resolved. There are still nations that threaten their neighbors and oppress their people. The world remains a dangerous place, and America must remain engaged, must remain strong, must continue to lead. But tonight, we can celebrate the fact that the world is safer than it was yesterday. The threat of global nuclear war has receded. The Iron Curtain has been torn down. Millions of people have gained their freedom and the ideals that America has championed. Democracy, human rights, free markets, the rule of law. Those ideals have proven their superiority over totalitarianism. The 20th century has been marked by terrible conflicts, 2 world wars, the Holocaust, the Cold War. But it has also been marked by the triumph of freedom over tyranny, of democracy over dictatorship, of hope over despair. As we approach the 21st century, let us resolve to build on that triumph, to extend freedom to all who seek it, to work for peace and prosperity for all nations. This is a moment of hope and possibility. Let us meet it with confidence and humility, with strength and compassion, with pride in what we have achieved and determination to build an even better world. Thank you, good night, and God bless the United States of America. The red light on the camera went off. Bush sat back in his chair, suddenly exhausted. Scowcroft entered from where he had been watching just off camera. "Well done, Mr. President. You struck exactly the right tone." Bush nodded, but he looked uncertain. "I wonder if people will think I wasn't celebratory enough." Reagan would have given a soaring speech about freedom's triumph. I gave them pragmatism. You gave them leadership, Scowcroft corrected. You gave them a path forward. Reagan was great at inspiring speeches, but you're the one who actually has to manage the transition. And that requires caution, nuance, partnership, all the things you just expressed. Bush stood and walked to the window, looking out at the south lawn. Somewhere out there, in the darkness, the world was changing in ways they could barely imagine. The Soviet Union was gone. The Cold War was over, and America stood alone as the world's sole superpower. You know what worries me, Bush said quietly. We spent 40 years defining ourselves in opposition to the Soviet Union. Everything we did, our foreign policy, our military posture, our national identity. It was all about the Cold War. Now that's gone. Who are we without an enemy to oppose? What do we stand for when we're not standing against something? It was a profound question, one that would haunt American foreign policy for the next 3 decades. In the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, the answer seemed clear. America would be the benevolent hegemon, spreading democracy and free markets, maintaining global order, leading through example and partnership. The end of history, as Francis Fukuyama would famously argue, the final triumph of liberal democracy. But the reality would prove more complex. Without the unifying threat of Soviet communism, American foreign policy would become more fractured, more uncertain. The Gulf War had seemed to herald a new era of American leadership, but the messy interventions in Somalia, Haiti, and the Balkans would reveal the limits of American power. The rise of terrorism, the emergence of China, the resurgence of Russian nationalism, all of these would challenge the post-Cold War order in ways Bush could not foresee on that Christmas night in 1991. We'll figure it out, Scowcroft said. We always do, but right now we should take a moment to appreciate what just happened. The Cold War ended peacefully. The Soviet Union collapsed without a nuclear exchange. Eastern Europe is free. Germany is reunited. That's a triumph by any measure. Bush turned from the window. You're right, and I'm proud of what we've achieved. I just hope we're wise enough to manage what comes next. They walked together out of the Oval Office, down the colonnade toward the residence, where Barbara Bush was waiting with the rest of the family. Tomorrow, the political analysis would begin. Pundits debating whether Bush had been too cautious, whether he had missed an opportunity to claim total victory, whether his speech had been inspiring enough. But tonight, on Christmas 1991, George H.W. Bush had done what he did best, managed a historic transition with competence, dignity, and strategic wisdom. He had acknowledged American victory without excessive triumphalism. He had praised Gorbachev without diminishing American achievement. He had looked forward to partnership rather than dwelling on past conflicts. It was not a speech that would be remembered as one of the great presidential addresses. It lacked the soaring rhetoric of Reagan or Kennedy, the moral clarity of Lincoln or FDR. But it was exactly what the moment required: steady leadership at a time of profound change, wisdom in victory, grace in triumph. In the days and weeks that followed, the reaction to Bush's speech was mixed. Conservatives criticized him for not celebrating more forcefully, for giving Gorbachev too much credit, for failing to claim Reagan's legacy. Liberals praised his restraint and his focus on partnership rather than triumphalism. Foreign policy experts debated whether he had struck the right balance. But in Russia and the other former Soviet republics, Bush's words were noted and appreciated. He had not gloated. He had not humiliated them. He had offered partnership and assistance. It created goodwill that would prove valuable in the difficult years ahead, as America worked with Russia to secure nuclear weapons, implement arms control treaties, and support economic reform. What George H.W. Bush said the night the Soviet Union died was, in essence, this: we won, but let's be gracious about it. The Cold War is over, but the work of building a better world continues. This is a moment for pride, but also for humility, for celebration, but also for responsibility. It was a very Bush message, pragmatic rather than ideological, forward-looking rather than backward-looking, focused on results rather than rhetoric. And while it may not have satisfied those who wanted a more triumphalist declaration of victory, it served America's interests well in the long run. The Cold War ended not with a bang, but with a carefully calibrated presidential address, delivered on Christmas night by a president who understood that true leadership means thinking beyond the immediate moment, beyond the political advantage, beyond the satisfaction of declaring victory. It means thinking about what comes next, about how to turn a moment of triumph into lasting progress, about how to win gracefully so that today's defeated adversary can become tomorrow's partner. George H.W. Bush would lose his re-election campaign less than a year later, defeated by Bill Clinton in a campaign that focused on domestic issues and economic anxiety. His careful management of the Cold War's end would not be enough to overcome recession and the perception that he was out of touch with ordinary Americans. History would remember him as a one-term president, a transitional figure between the Reagan era and the Clinton years. But on that Christmas night in 1991, sitting in the Oval Office and choosing his words carefully, George H.W. Bush did something that mattered more than political survival. He helped end the most dangerous confrontation in human history with wisdom, grace, and strategic vision. He chose partnership over triumphalism, humility over arrogance, the long view over short-term political gain. The Soviet Union died at noon on December the 25th, 1991. And that night, the President of the United States told the world how America would respond to its victory, not with a victory dance, but with an outstretched hand, not with gloating, but with an invitation to build a better future together. It was, in its quiet way, one of the finest moments of the Bush presidency, and it set the tone for how the world's sole remaining superpower would navigate the uncertain, hopeful, dangerous years that followed the Cold War's end.